She showed up with a Realtor on my land and pointing at my porch like it was already listed. I hadn't posted a sale sign. Hell, I hadn't even thought about moving. But there they were, measuring windows, filming my dock, telling each other what this side of the lake could go for. I didn't yell, I didn't chase, I just locked the gate and put up a sign they couldn't ignore. That's when things got weird, real fast. This one's got fake rules, forged papers, and a whole lot of nerve. Let me know in the comments if you'd have handled it the same way. I bought my cabin 6 months ago for one simple reason: peace. After 15 years of teaching high school history to teenagers who think the Civil War happened in the 1920s, I needed somewhere quiet to recharge. The place sits at the end of a dirt road about 20 minutes outside town, surrounded by pine trees and blessed silence. Well, it was blessed silence until Diane Sterling moved in next door. I'm 35 years old, and I've dealt with difficult people before, but nothing quite prepared me for what was coming. That's when the sharp click of heels shattered the silence. I'm standing there in my pajamas, coffee mug in hand, watching Buddy sniff around the fence line like he's conducting some kind of canine investigation. She marched down my gravel path in a suit that screamed courtroom, not pine trees, holding up her phone and taking pictures of my dog. Not asking permission, not waving hello, just click, 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 like Buddy's some kind of tourist attraction. I didn't move, but my coffee did. Sloshed out of the mug as my grip tightened. I walked over, still trying to give her the benefit of the doubt, because maybe she's new to the area and doesn't understand boundaries yet. Maybe she's just a dog lover who got carried away. But when I get closer, she looks me up and down with this expression, like I'm something unpleasant she stepped in. Then she says, and I quote, "This dog doesn't meet the aesthetic standards of our neighborhood." Aesthetic standards? Who died and made her the neighborhood committee? I'm standing there in my own yard on my own property that I pay taxes on, and this stranger is critiquing my dog's appearance like he's failed some kind of beauty pageant. I introduce myself as politely as I could manage under the circumstances. "Hi, I'm Nate. I live here, and this is Buddy. Nice to meet you." She barely acknowledges the introduction before launching into what can only be described as a lecture about maintaining community standards and protecting property values. Apparently, according to Diane Sterling, former company president and self-appointed neighborhood watch captain, my cabin represents a concerning trend toward, and these were her exact words, declining neighborhood character. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. The thing is, I did my research before buying this place. The dirt road leading to my cabin, legally mine according to the county records. Private property with clear documentation going back decades. I spent weeks in the courthouse basement, going through old surveys and title documents, because that's what history teachers do. We research things properly. But Diane seemed to have her own version of reality where my private road was somehow community property that she could use for her morning power walks. Every single day, there she'd be marching up and down my driveway like she owned it. My neighbor Monica, a sweet lady in her 60s, who lives on the other side of me, stopped me a few days later with a casserole and what she probably thought was helpful advice. Monica has lived here for 20 years and knows everyone's business, but she's the kind of person who delivers gossip wrapped in genuine concern. She mentioned casually while we're standing on my porch that the guy who owned my place before me left real suddenly last year. Never did say why, just packed up one weekend and disappeared. The way she said it with this meaningful look in her eyes made me wonder if there was more to the story. I should have paid more attention to what Monica was trying to tell me, but honestly, I was still in that honeymoon phase with my new place. I loved waking up to bird songs instead of car alarms. I loved having space to think and grade papers without my upstairs neighbor's music bleeding through thin apartment walls. The cabin needed work, sure, but it was mine, my sanctuary. My escape from the chaos of teenage drama and administrative meetings that never seemed to accomplish anything meaningful. But even in those early weeks, I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. Diane would position herself at her kitchen window with a cup of coffee and just watch. Not in a friendly, neighborly way, but like she was taking notes. Mental notes about when I left for work, when I came home, what kind of car I drove, how often I had visitors. It felt invasive, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe she was just bored. Maybe she was curious about the new guy. Maybe I was reading too much into perfectly innocent behavior. Looking back, I should have trusted my instincts from day one. Should have recognized the warning signs that Diane wasn't just being a nosy neighbor. She was studying me, figuring out my routines and my weaknesses, planning something that would completely upend my quiet little life. But at the time, I brushed off Monica's cryptic comment and tried to focus on the positive aspects of my new home. I had no idea that Diane was already 3 steps ahead, orchestrating a campaign that would test every ounce of patience and determination I had. I should have paid more attention to what Monica said because Diane was already planning her next move. 3 days after the photo incident, I found the first unsigned notice taped to my front door when I got home from work. It was typed on plain white paper, no letterhead, no official seal, but it was formatted to look important. Multiple pet violations and noise complaints from concerned neighbors, it claimed. Failure to comply with community standards regarding animal control and property maintenance. The language was formal enough to be intimidating, but vague enough to mean absolutely nothing. What really caught my attention was the phrasing: property value preservation and maintaining community standards. The exact same words Diane had used when she was lecturing me about Buddy's aesthetic shortcomings. I read that notice 3 times looking for any kind of official identification or contact information. Nothing, just accusations and demands with no way to verify who sent it or what authority they claimed to represent. My first instinct was to crumple it up and throw it away, but something made me keep it. Maybe it was my teacher brain kicking in the part of me that's trained to document everything, because you never know when you'll need evidence later. Or maybe I was starting to understand that this wasn't going to be an isolated incident. The second notice arrived exactly 1 week later, this time claiming to be from the city planning office. Official-looking header, formal language, threatening tone. All cabin renovations must cease immediately pending zoning compliance review. Failure to comply will result in fines and legal action. This one really got my attention because I hadn't started any renovations yet. I was still in the planning phase, still getting quotes from contractors and researching permits. How could I be violating regulations for work? I hadn't even begun. I called the city planning office first thing the next morning, prepared to explain my situation and find out what paperwork I'd somehow missed. The conversation lasted about 30 seconds. No record of any correspondence sent to my address, no violations filed against my property, no pending zoning reviews or compliance issues. The woman on the phone sounded genuinely confused about why I was calling. She offered to mail me the actual renovation permit applications, which was helpful, but it also confirmed what I was starting to suspect. Someone was trying to intimidate me with fake official documents. That's when I decided to take my first real stand. I drove to the hardware store and bought the clearest, most official-looking private property no trespassing sign I could find. Posted it right at the entrance to my dirt road where nobody could miss it. If someone wanted to play games with fake authority, I'd respond with real authority. My property, my rules clearly posted according to the state law. I felt pretty good about that decision for exactly 48 hours. Because that's when Diane decided to escalate things in a way that still makes my blood pressure spike when I think about it. I'm in my kitchen making breakfast when I hear voices outside. Not unusual since sound carries in the morning air, but these voices are coming from my yard. I look out the window and there's Diane walking around my property with a young guy in a cheap suit carrying a clipboard and a measuring tape. They're pointing at my cabin, gesturing toward the road, having what appears to be a very serious professional discussion about my home. I threw on some clothes and marched outside trying to keep my temper in check, but definitely failing to hide my confusion. "Excuse me, can I help you?" The young guy who introduced himself as Mark Thompson from Premier Realty looked genuinely surprised to see me, like he hadn't expected the homeowner to be home during his mysterious property evaluation. Diane, on the other hand, didn't miss a beat. She had this practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes and started talking like she was doing me some kind of favor. "Oh, I assumed you'd want to sell this old place and move somewhere more suitable," she said, like we'd previously discussed this arrangement and I'd somehow forgotten. "Mark here specializes in properties that need transitional owners." Transitional owners? What does that even mean? I looked at Mark, who was clearly uncomfortable, and starting to realize he'd been brought into a situation he didn't understand. The poor kid was probably 28 years old, new to real estate, and trusting his clients to tell him the truth about listing arrangements. I asked the obvious question: "Who told you this property was for sale?" Mark shuffled through his papers, looking increasingly nervous, and admitted that Diane had contacted his office about representing the property. She'd provided property details, described the owner as motivated to sell quickly, and scheduled this preliminary assessment without mentioning that the motivated owner had never actually agreed to list the property. Did she really think I wouldn't notice strangers evaluating my home for a sale I'd never authorized? Mark apologized profusely and packed up his measuring equipment, while Diane stood there with her arms crossed, acting like I was the one being unreasonable. After he drove away, she turned to me with this condescending tone that made my teeth ache. You know, Nate, people who don't fit in with community expectations often find it easier to relocate somewhere more appropriate. There was something about the way she emphasized appropriate that made my skin crawl. Was it just about the cabin? Or something else entirely? I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but the whole interaction felt loaded with meaning I couldn't quite identify. That night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I had to ask myself some hard questions. Was I being too sensitive? Was Diane just an aggressive real estate enthusiast who got carried away? Or was this part of something bigger, something more calculated and deliberate? The fake notices, the unauthorized property showing the veiled threats about not fitting in. It felt like a pattern, but I couldn't prove anything yet. All I had were suspicions and a growing certainty that my peaceful cabin life was about to get a lot more complicated. That's when it hit me. Diane wasn't just being pushy, she was running some kind of con game. That's when it hit me. Diane wasn't just being pushy, she was running some kind of con game. The next morning, I made a decision that probably saved my sanity and definitely escalated this whole situation into something I never could have imagined. I drove to the hardware store and bought the heaviest chain and padlock they had in stock. The clerk asked if I was securing a storage unit or a gate, and when I explained I was protecting my private driveway from trespassers, he nodded knowingly and threw in some extra warning signs for free. Apparently, I wasn't the first person in town dealing with boundary disputes. If Diane wanted to play games with my property boundaries, I'd make those boundaries crystal clear. The gate at the entrance to my dirt road got locked up tight, and I posted a sign that couldn't be misunderstood by anyone with basic reading skills. Warning private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Not for sale. Maybe that last part was petty, but after the unauthorized real estate showing, I figured it needed to be said. I even added smaller signs along the fence line just in case anyone claimed they didn't notice the main warning. The whole installation took about 3 hours, and by the time I finished, my property looked like a fortress, which, given what was coming next, turned out to be pretty appropriate. I felt pretty good about my decisive action for exactly 24 hours. That's how long it took for Diane to discover my new security measures and completely lose whatever semblance of composure she'd been maintaining. I'm sitting at my kitchen table grading papers and enjoying my morning coffee when I hear this commotion outside that sounds like someone's having a very public breakdown. I look out the window, and there's Diane at my locked gate with poor Mark Thompson standing beside her, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. She's rattling the chain like she's testing its strength, and I can see her face getting redder by the minute. She's shouting loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. This is completely illegal. You cannot block established public access. Community members have rights that cannot be violated by one individual's selfish actions. Her voice had that shrill quality people get when they're used to getting their way and suddenly discover the world doesn't actually revolve around them. I walked outside partly because I needed to address this situation and partly because I was genuinely curious to see how far she was willing to take this performance. When she saw me approaching her, voice got even louder, like she was playing to an audience that extended beyond just Mark and me. I kept my voice calm and level, which seemed to frustrate her even more. Ma'am, this is my documented private property. Your confusion about ownership doesn't change legal facts. If you need access to somewhere, I'm sure there's a public road that can get you there. Mark was nodding along, clearly uncomfortable with whatever story Diane had told him. The poor guy was probably starting to realize that his client might not be the most reliable source of information about property ownership and community access rights. He kept checking his phone like he was hoping for an emergency call that would give him an excuse to leave. But Diane wasn't finished. She pointed her finger at me like she was delivering some kind of courtroom verdict and declared that I would be hearing from her attorney about my illegal obstruction of community property. The way she said attorney with this smug emphasis made it clear she thought the threat of legal action would make me back down immediately. Then she stalked off toward her house, leaving Mark to apologize awkwardly and drive away for the second time in a week. I should have felt victorious, but something about her confidence made me uneasy. She didn't sound like someone who was bluffing. She sounded like someone who had a plan and experience using that plan successfully. 72 hours later, I understood exactly what that plan was. The court summons arrived by certified mail official seal and everything. The Pine Valley Homeowners Association versus Nathan Mitchell, claiming I was obstructing established community access rights and violating HOA covenants that I'd supposedly agreed to when I purchased my property. Wait, they're actually suing me for protecting my own property that I have a deed for. The documents were thick, official-looking, and completely terrifying to someone who had never been sued before. The problem was, I'd never joined any HOA, never signed any agreements, never received any bylaws or covenants, never paid any fees or attended any meetings. But according to these documents, my property was automatically included in the Pine Valley Homeowners Association by virtue of its location, and I was bound by rules I'd never seen to provide access I'd never agreed to grant. The whole thing felt like someone had decided to rewrite reality and expected me to go along with their revised version of property law. How could I be bound by agreements I'd never made with an organization I'd never heard of until they decided to sue me? I spent the next week calling every attorney in the phone book, and let me tell you, that was an education in how the legal system really works when you're not wealthy. 7 different lawyers basically told me the same thing. HOA disputes are expensive, time-consuming, and rarely won by individual homeowners. But lawyer number 8 was different. Harold Patterson had been practicing property law for 30 years, and instead of immediately trying to talk me out of pursuing the case, he started asking detailed questions about the specific documents I'd received. When I mentioned seeing blacked-out sections in some of the HOA's boundary maps, he got this look in his eyes like a detective who just spotted a crucial clue. Those redacted areas shouldn't exist in legitimate property documents filed with the county, he explained. Official records don't get censored for homeowner disputes. If they're hiding information in documents they're using to sue you, we need to find out what they don't want you to see. Harold agreed to take my case, but he was honest about the uphill battle we were facing. HOA. Legal teams are experienced at intimidating individual property owners into compliance, he warned me. They'll drag this out for 2 to 3 years if necessary, hoping you'll run out of money before they run out of patience. But there's something about these documents that doesn't add up, and I'd like to find out what they're trying to hide. The way he said it with this quiet confidence made me think he'd seen this kind of situation before. That night, I sat on my porch with Buddy at my feet, looking out at my peaceful cabin and wondering if I was about to lose everything I'd worked for. The legal fees alone could bankrupt me, even if I eventually won. And if I lost, I'd be forced to tear down my gate grant access to anyone who claimed community rights and probably end up selling to get away from the ongoing harassment. Maybe that was exactly what Diane was counting on. Maybe this whole elaborate legal strategy was designed to accomplish what the fake notices and unauthorized showings hadn't managed to achieve. Harold's confidence should have made me feel better, but his warning about uncovering uncomfortable truths left me wondering what kind of secrets Diane was hiding. While Harold was digging into the legal documents, Diane was launching a completely different kind of attack on my life. The first anonymous flyer appeared on the community bulletin board at the grocery store, typed in that same formal language I'd seen in the fake violation notices. Disruptive resident on 8th Street, engaging in aggressive behavior toward longtime community members. Multiple noise complaints regarding late-night disturbances and unleashed animals. The flyer didn't mention my name specifically, but anyone who knew about the HOA lawsuit would know exactly who it was describing. What really bothered me was how professional it looked, like it had been designed by someone with experience in public relations or marketing campaigns. The thing that really got to me was how carefully crafted the lies were. Late-night parties, I'm in bed by 10:30 most nights because I have to be at school by 7:15 the next morning. The loudest noise I make after dark is probably my coffee grinder at 6 a.m., and that's inside my house with all the windows closed. Aggressive behavior. The only time I'd raised my voice was when I found strangers evaluating my property without permission, and I'd think most people would consider that a reasonable response. Unleashed animals. Buddy has never been outside without either a leash or the fenced area of my own yard. But lies don't have to be true to be effective, especially when they're designed to make people afraid of their neighbors. The social isolation started almost immediately, and it was more systematic than I'd expected. Neighbors who used to wave when I drove past suddenly found other things to look at. The woman who runs the coffee shop downtown, where I'd been going every Saturday morning for months, started acting like she didn't recognize me. When I tried to make conversation about the weather, she'd give me these tight, uncomfortable smiles and find urgent tasks that required her immediate attention. Even the mail carrier who used to stop and chat about the weather or ask about my teaching job now just dropped off my mail and hurried away like I might be contagious with something unpleasant. Harold had warned me this might happen, but experiencing it was different from just knowing it was possible. He'd handled enough HOA disputes to understand their playbook perfectly. They'll try to isolate you socially before they destroy you legally, he'd explained during one of our strategy meetings. If they can convince your neighbors that you're the problem, you'll have no community support when the real legal battles begin. It's psychological warfare designed to make you feel like giving up is your only option for getting your life back to normal. The goal is to make you so miserable that paying their demands seems like a bargain compared to continued harassment. The financial pressure was mounting too, and I was starting to understand why so many people just gave up and moved away. Harold's retainer had wiped out most of my savings, and he'd been brutally honest about the potential costs ahead. HOA lawsuits can drag on for 2 to 3 years. He'd warned me potentially costing $40,000 to $60,000 in legal fees, even if you win in the end. Even if you win. Those words kept echoing in my head during the sleepless nights when I'd lie awake calculating how long I could afford to keep fighting before I lost everything. My teaching salary was decent, but it wasn't designed to support extended legal warfare against people with unlimited resources. But the worst part was watching how expertly Diane manipulated the community narrative. She'd started showing up at neighborhood events I'd never even known existed. Book clubs, coffee meetups, volunteer committees for local charities. Suddenly, she was everywhere, positioning herself as a concerned longtime resident, dealing with an unstable newcomer who threatened community safety and property values. I heard about these appearances secondhand from Monica, who was still speaking to me but seemed increasingly uncomfortable about maintaining that friendship. Monica would stop by with information, but always with this guilty expression, like she was betraying someone by continuing to associate with me. Monica stopped by one evening with another casserole and some information I definitely needed to hear, though I could tell she'd rather be anywhere else. Diane's been telling people you threatened her physically during that argument at your gate, she said quietly, like she was afraid of being overheard even in my own kitchen. She's also claiming your dog attacked her during one of her morning walks, and that you've been playing loud music at all hours to harass the neighbors. Monica looked genuinely troubled as she shared this information, like she was wrestling with her own doubts about what was true. I know it's not true, she said finally, but she's very convincing when she tells these stories. She has this way of making everything sound reasonable and factual. I wanted to be angry, but mostly I just felt exhausted and overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of it all. How do you fight lies that are specifically designed to make you look guilty if you deny them too vigorously? If I went around the neighborhood defending myself against accusations of threatening behavior, wouldn't that just make me seem more threatening and unstable? If I insisted that my dog had never attacked anyone, wouldn't that sound exactly like what a dangerous dog owner would say? Regardless of the truth, Diane had created a perfect trap where any response I made could be twisted into evidence supporting her narrative about my supposed instability and aggression. The breaking point came when Harold called with an update on his document analysis, and the news wasn't encouraging. The HOA's legal papers contained multiple red flags, he reported during our phone conversation. Inconsistent formatting, mismatched fonts, date sequences that didn't make chronological sense. But forensic document analysis takes time and costs money we might not have. We need to decide whether to invest in expert testimony that might prove these documents are fraudulent or try to settle this case before the legal fees bankrupt both of us. Even Harold, who'd seemed confident about finding the truth, was starting to sound concerned about the practical realities of fighting this battle. That same week, Diane made what she probably considered a generous peace offering, and the timing couldn't have been more calculated. She approached me in the grocery store parking lot, where I couldn't avoid the conversation, without looking paranoid to any potential witnesses who might be watching. "I've been thinking about our situation," she said with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes, "and I believe I have a reasonable solution that could work for everyone involved. Pay a $5,000 community fine for the disruption you've caused issue, a written public apology acknowledging your mistakes, and agree to relocate within 6 months. then all of this unpleasantness can be forgotten, and we can all move on with our lives. $5,000 for what crime exactly? And relocate from the property I own legally and bought with my own money. But the way she said it with that tone of someone offering a generous compromise after lengthy consideration made it clear she expected me to be grateful for the opportunity to surrender completely. When I didn't immediately accept her terms, her expression shifted to something colder and more calculating. "I've handled difficult situations like this before, Nate," she said quietly, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "People who don't cooperate with community standards, well, let's just say life becomes very unpleasant for them, much more unpleasant than what you've experienced so far." Walking away from that conversation, I felt like I was drowning in quicksand, and every move I made just pulled me deeper. Every move I made seemed to make things worse, and every day brought new evidence that Diane had resources and connections I couldn't match. The legal bills were mounting, the community had turned against me, and now I was facing direct threats about how much more unpleasant my life could become if I didn't surrender to her demands. Have you ever had an entire community turn against you over something you know is absolutely right? Because, let me tell you, it's a special kind of hell that makes you question everything you thought you knew about justice and fairness and whether doing the right thing is worth the cost. That night, lying awake and staring at the ceiling, while Buddy snored peacefully beside me, I had to ask myself the hardest question of all. Was I fighting for justice, or just being too stubborn to know when I was beaten? Was I fighting for justice, or just being too stubborn to know when I was beaten? The next morning, I drove to Harold's office with a heavy heart and a prepared speech about cutting my losses before this legal battle completely destroyed my financial future. I'd spent the entire night staring at my bank statements, calculating how much longer I could afford to fight before I lost everything I'd worked for. Maybe Diane's right about everything, I thought, as I parked outside Harold's building. Maybe I should just take whatever deal keeps me out of complete financial ruin and start over somewhere else. The idea of admitting defeat made me physically sick, but bankruptcy seemed worse than humiliation at that point. I sat in Harold's waiting room, rehearsing my surrender speech and trying to convince myself that strategic retreat wasn't the same thing as cowardice. Maybe this was just reality. Maybe people like Diane with their money and connections and willingness to lie without conscience always won these battles. Maybe the system was designed to protect people who could afford to abuse it, and naive idealists like me were just collateral damage in a game we never understood. You know, I've shared stories like this before, and I always wondered how people found the strength to keep fighting when absolutely everything seemed hopeless. Harold's secretary called my name, and I walked into his office prepared to discuss settlement terms and damage control. Maybe we could negotiate the fine down to something I could actually afford, or work out a payment plan that wouldn't force me to declare bankruptcy. Maybe if I agreed to relocate voluntarily, Diane would be satisfied with her victory and not pursue additional damages. These were the thoughts running through my head when Harold looked up from his desk with an expression I couldn't quite read. Before I could launch into my prepared speech about strategic surrender, he held up his hand. "I need to show you something," he said, and there was something in his voice that made me forget all about settlement negotiations. "While you were dealing with Diane's psychological warfare campaign, I've been digging deeper into these property records, and what I found changes everything about this case." He spread out a large county survey map from 1994 across his desk, and I could see my property clearly marked with boundary lines that looked nothing like the maps in the HOA's legal documents. The road leading to my cabin was highlighted in yellow with official markings I'd never seen before. "This road has been legally classified as a public easement in county records for over 30 years, Harold explained, pointing to the official stamps and signatures that covered the bottom of the survey map. "If this road is officially public easement, then the HOA never had any legal authority to control access in the first place. Their entire lawsuit is built on completely false premises because they're claiming ownership of something that legally belongs to the county." I stared at the map, trying to process what this meant for everything that had happened over the past few months. They mistook solitude for surrender. Big mistake. Harold pulled out another stack of documents, these ones bearing official county seals and registration numbers. "Look at these current HOA maps," he said, pointing to the boundary descriptions they'd submitted with their lawsuit. "Someone has systematically removed all references to the public easement designation that appears clearly on every official county record dating back decades. These aren't innocent mistakes or clerical errors. This is deliberate document alteration, designed to create false ownership claims for legal intimidation. The evidence was right there in black and white, impossible to deny or explain away. But here's the really interesting part, Harold continued, and I could see that detective gleam in his eyes again. These alterations were done professionally, using the same fonts and formatting as the original documents. Someone with access to legal software and document production equipment created these forgeries specifically to support fraudulent property claims. We're not just talking about a neighbor dispute anymore. We're talking about systematic document fraud that could constitute federal crimes under Title 18 of the Criminal Code, their lawyer replied with silence. That's when I knew they'd seen the mistake too. I made a digital trail, GPS tagged every inch, not for fun, for court. Instead of just defending against HOA accusations, Harold proposed filing countersuits for harassment, submission of fraudulent legal documents, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We have everything we need to prove their claims are not just wrong, but criminally fraudulent, he explained. The question now is whether we pursue this as a civil matter or refer it directly to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. The power dynamic had completely shifted in the span of a 30-minute meeting. Diane's entire intimidation strategy depended on people not researching the actual legal facts or being too scared and broke to fight back effectively. But now, we had legitimate evidence of criminal fraud, documented proof that everything she'd claimed about HOA authority was deliberately fabricated. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a real chance not just to survive this battle, but to win it decisively. Walking out of Harold's office that afternoon, I felt like I'd been given a second chance at justice. The financial pressure was still real, and the community isolation still hurt, but now I had something Diane didn't expect. I had the truth documented and verified by official county records that couldn't be altered or intimidated into submission. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Diane still had one final card to play, and someone who had gone this far wouldn't surrender without a fight. Walking out of Harold's office, I felt like I'd been handed a loaded weapon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Diane still had one final card to play. That feeling turned out to be prophetic when I got home and found a new notice on my door. Then a notice. Violation unauthorized structure. Only I hadn't built anything. The morning of our court hearing, Diane arrived looking like she was attending a board meeting rather than defending a lawsuit. Professional legal representation, 3 boxes of meticulously organized documentation, and an attitude that radiated absolute confidence in her position. She'd brought Richard Steinberg, an HOA attorney with 20 years of experience who probably handled cases like this in his sleep. The guy looked like he charged more per hour than I made in a month, and he carried himself with the kind of arrogance that comes from rarely losing in court. She smiled the way lawyers smile when the cameras are off, calculated, empty. Steinberg's opening presentation was impressive, I'll give him that. He laid out what appeared to be comprehensive historical proof of HOA road ownership dating back to the original 1980s development plans. Map surveys, property transfers, maintenance records, everything perfectly formatted and professionally bound, looking exactly like the kind of evidence that wins property disputes. If I hadn't known what Harold had discovered, I probably would have been convinced by the sheer volume and apparent authenticity of their documentation. I went live before they even started their fake vote. Viewers jumped from 40 to 600 in under 10 minutes. But Harold had taught me to look for details that most people miss, and as Steinberg presented his case, I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. The dates on some documents seemed inconsistent with the chronological narrative he was building. Font styles that looked slightly different between pages that were supposedly created at the same time. Small discrepancies that individually meant nothing, but together suggested something wasn't quite right about these perfectly organized legal exhibits. Harold's cross-examination started with seemingly innocent questions about document origins and chain of custody. Where exactly did these records come from? Who maintained them over the years? What kind of storage and handling procedures were used to preserve their integrity? Steinberg answered confidently, but I could see Diane getting increasingly tense as Harold methodically established the foundation for what was coming next. Her confident posture shifted to rigid attention, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Your Honor, before we address the content of these documents," Harold said with perfect timing, "I'd like to establish their authenticity through expert analysis." That's when he dropped the first bombshell. My forensic document examiner has identified several concerning inconsistencies that suggest these exhibits may not be authentic historical records. Richard Steinberg's confident expression faltered for the first time, and I saw him exchange a quick worried glance with Diane. The expert witness testimony was devastating in its technical precision. Documents supposedly created in 2010 contained Arial narrow font variations that weren't commercially available until 2016. Digital compression artifacts indicated these pages had been scanned and digitally manipulated multiple times. Most damning of all, computer analysis revealed clear evidence of content insertion. I read her fake bylaw aloud, word for word on stream, then pulled up the actual zoning map. I watched Diane's face during this presentation, and it was like watching someone's entire world crumble in real time. The confident mask she'd worn for months dissolved into something approaching panic, as Harold methodically dismantled every piece of evidence her expensive attorney had presented. Even Steinberg looked genuinely shocked, probably realizing he'd been provided with forged documents that could destroy his professional reputation and potentially subject him to ethics violations. Harold saved the best for last. "Your Honor," he announced, producing the original county easement filing in a protective sleeve. "This is the actual historical record of road ownership for the disputed property. As the court can see, it clearly establishes public easement status dating back to 1987, with proper county registration and official seals. Every section that appears in this authentic document was systematically removed from the defendant's forged versions." Judge Morrison studied the authentic document through a magnifying glass, comparing it side by side with the HOA's submitted evidence. The differences were impossible to ignore. Where the real county record showed public easement markings, the HOA versions showed private property claims. Where official stamps and registration numbers appeared on legitimate documents, the forgeries contained altered or completely fabricated authority markings. The courtroom was dead silent as Judge Morrison set down the magnifying glass and looked directly at Diane and her attorney. "This court finds clear and convincing evidence of systematic document forgery," he announced in a voice that carried the weight of absolute judicial authority. "Not only does the HOA completely lack legal standing to control this public easement, but the submission of fraudulent documents in legal proceedings constitutes criminal fraud under state and federal statutes." Richard Steinberg immediately requested a sidebar conference, probably trying to distance himself from his client's criminal activity before it destroyed his career. I could see him whispering urgently to Judge Morrison, likely explaining that he'd been deceived about the authenticity of the evidence he'd been asked to present. Professional attorneys don't knowingly submit forged documents to federal courts. Judge Morrison called for a 30-minute recess to consult with the district attorney's office about criminal referral procedures, and the courtroom erupted in whispered conversations. Diane sat frozen at the defendant's table, probably realizing for the first time that her elaborate intimidation scheme had crossed the line from civil harassment into federal criminal territory. Document forgery in legal proceedings wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was a felony that could result in serious prison time. Have you ever watched someone's entire world crumble in real time? Because that's exactly what was happening to Diane right in front of me. And I have to admit, after months of harassment and intimidation, it felt like justice was finally being served. But as we waited for court to resume, I realized this had gone way beyond just my property dispute. Someone screamed off camera, then the feed cut, not on my end. Someone screamed off camera, then the feed cut, not on my end. When court resumed after the recess, Judge Morrison's expression left no doubt about what was coming next. He'd spent 30 minutes consulting with the district attorney's office, and the weight of federal law enforcement was now behind every word he spoke. Not only does the HOA completely lack legal standing to control this public easement, he announced in a voice that carried absolute judicial authority, but this court finds clear and convincing evidence of willful document fraud requiring immediate criminal investigation under state and federal statutes. The court stripped her access. The judge called it deliberate fraud. Her lawyer didn't even look up. The immediate legal consequences hit like an avalanche. Judge Morrison dismissed all charges against me with prejudice, meaning the HOA could never sue me again on these same claims, and ordered them to reimburse my complete legal expenses within 30 days. But that was just the beginning of Diane's legal nightmare. All of her forged documents were officially forwarded to the district attorney for prosecution under state fraud statutes carrying potential sentences of 5 to 7 years in federal prison. I watched her face go completely white as the judge explained that document forgery in legal proceedings wasn't just a civil matter anymore. Richard Steinberg immediately moved to withdraw as HOA counsel, probably trying to save his career from the wreckage of his client's criminal activity. Professional attorneys don't knowingly submit fraudulent evidence to federal courts, and I could see him whispering urgently with his paralegal about damage control and ethics board notifications. But Harold wasn't finished delivering justice. "Your Honor, our investigation discovered this wasn't Diane's first fraud attempt," he announced, and I saw Diane's last shred of composure completely dissolve. "We found similar forged documents used against 3 previous property owners in this same neighborhood. This represents a pattern of systematic fraud designed to intimidate homeowners into below-market property sales for personal profit." The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations as Harold presented evidence that Diane had been running this scam for years. Property records showed 3 other cabin owners who'd sold their homes within 6 months of receiving HOA violation notices and lawsuit threats. Each sale was significantly below market value, and each property had been quickly flipped by investors connected to Diane's real estate network. She hadn't just been harassing me, she'd been systematically targeting newcomers with fake legal threats to force profitable property transfers. Judge Morrison studied the additional evidence with growing disgust. This court finds evidence of an ongoing criminal enterprise designed to defraud property owners through systematic document forgery and legal intimidation, he declared. The defendants will remain in this jurisdiction, pending criminal investigation, and all assets related to these fraudulent schemes are subject to immediate seizure. RICO. I'd only heard that term in movies about organized crime, but apparently it applied to systematic fraud operations too. The community vindication was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors who had completely shunned me for months now understood they'd been manipulated by fabricated complaints. Mrs. Henderson from down the street actually approached me outside the courthouse with tears in her eyes, apologizing for believing Diane's lies about my threatening behavior. The coffee shop owner who'd been treating me like a dangerous pariah came over to shake my hand and offer free breakfast for a month. Monica was vindicated too, and she looked genuinely relieved to finally speak freely about her suspicions. "I knew something was seriously wrong," she admitted as we walked to our cars. But Diane had this way of making anyone who questioned her seem like they were the problem. The symbolic victory moment came when I drove home and saw that the private HOA property sign had been completely removed from the road entrance. Just an empty post and some scattered hardware where Diane's territorial claims used to assert authority she'd never legally possessed. Harold had arranged for the county to install an official public easement marker in its place, making it clear that this road belonged to the community, not to any fraudulent homeowners association. Diane's forced exodus was swift and complete. Unable to face criminal prosecution and total community shame, she emergency listed her house within 48 hours. The for sale sign went up on a Friday, and by the following Tuesday she was gone. No goodbye parties, no forwarding address, just a moving truck, and the sudden absence of the person who'd made my life hell for 6 months. She walked out of the courthouse flanked by press. I stayed just long enough to see her realize they weren't there for her side. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same woman who'd tried to force me to sell was now desperately fleeing the neighborhood to escape the consequences of her own criminal behavior. The legal precedent we'd established was bigger than just my property dispute. Harold explained that our victory created important case law protecting other homeowners from similar fraudulent HOA intimidation tactics. Property rights attorneys across the state were already citing our case in their own document fraud investigations. Apparently, fake HOA schemes were more common than anyone realized, and our successful prosecution was encouraging other victims to come forward. The community healing process was remarkable to witness. Within 2 weeks of Diane's departure, the neighborhood organized a welcome block party specifically to celebrate my victory. Kids were running around with buddy neighbors were sharing food and stories, and everyone seemed genuinely embarrassed about how easily they had been manipulated by Diane's lies. It was the kind of neighborhood gathering I'd imagined when I first bought my cabin, the sense of genuine community that Diane's manipulation had temporarily destroyed. Buddy, of course, was completely oblivious to all the legal drama and community politics. He just enjoyed having his owner relaxed and genuinely happy again. No more tense phone calls with lawyers, no more sleepless nights worrying about bankruptcy, no more walking on eggshells around hostile neighbors. The new sign reads, "Private, trespassers will be streamed." Underneath Karen, that means you. Maybe it was petty, but after everything Diane had put me through, I figured I'd earn the right to a little humor at her expense. The sign became something of a local landmark, with people driving by just to take pictures and share them with friends who'd heard about our legal battle. Some visitors even left small gifts by the gate, tokens of support from strangers who'd followed the story online. The personal growth aspect of this experience taught me something important about standing up to bullies. Sometimes backing down from people like Diane just enables them to victimize others, making resistance a moral obligation rather than just personal stubbornness. If I'd accepted her first settlement offer, she would have moved on to terrorize the next newcomer who couldn't afford to fight back. Complete financial justice came when the court ordered Diane to reimburse not only my legal expenses, but also damages to the 3 previous homeowners she'd defrauded. The total judgment was over $200,000, ensuring she'd face complete financial accountability for years of criminal fraud. Even if she avoided prison time, she'd be broke for the rest of her life, paying back the people she'd victimized. The bigger picture lesson was something I'd try to remember for the rest of my life. Sometimes people assume that having money and projected confidence makes them untouchable, that they can intimidate anyone into submission through sheer persistence and legal bullying. Diane learned the hard way that truth and actual legal facts still matter more than intimidation. Bullies like Diane count on people being too scared, too tired, or too broke to fight back effectively. They build their entire strategy around the assumption that normal people will give up rather than risk everything in a legal battle against someone with more resources. But every once in a while, they pick exactly the wrong person. Someone stubborn enough to keep fighting, lucky enough to find the right lawyer, and persistent enough to uncover the truth that destroys their whole criminal enterprise. And that's the story of how a high school history teacher with a dog named Buddy exposed a criminal conspiracy and saved his entire neighborhood from a serial fraud. Sometimes justice really does win, but only when good people refuse to give up and keep fighting for what's right, even when everything seems hopeless. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, and people who build their power on lies always fall harder than they expect. And if that sounds unbelievable, just wait until you hear how it started. No threats, no warning, just a woman in heels and a realtor with a clipboard standing on my porch, like they already owned the place. They didn't expect me to push back. They definitely didn't expect me to document, live stream, and drag their whole operation into the daylight. But that's the thing about people who mistake quiet for weak. They only see the bark when it's too late to run from the bite. Welcome to QA Stories. Let me tell you what happened, and you tell me in the comments what would you have done.
From all of us here at QA Stories, thank you for watching. Smash that like button, drop a comment, and join us again for more unbelievable stories.